including not just race, but other aspects of racial discourse, which can include class, gender, culture, linguistic, psychological, somatic, and again, cultural markers. Right, so throughout a lot of this work, there is a sense that racial discourse works by weaving a narrow set of lexical elements into a kind of a tightly fitting, stylized costume. So I took this kind of these ideas, and for me, they what I wanted to see if I could get this kind of general perspective on race and ethnic bias, in particular within the context of Japanese empire, which is what I work on. I decided to extend Said's intuition and extract the vocabularies that commonly adhered to representations of colonial others. Now, there's countless case studies that have sort of cataloged a wide variety of tropes and stereotypes in fiction of the period. So we're talking about the early 20th century here. And these studies often assert an underlying shared structure, basically variations on Said's library, from which the tropes are drawn, right? And I was curious to see what that library might look like, or if we could find any larger structure at all using computational methods. So, for example, given a passage like this, which is from a famous novel set in Shanghai, colonial Shanghai, could I relate it to a much larger library of racializing discourse? In here we have this is actually a conversation between some Japanese protagonists who are living in Shanghai, talking about the Chinese as, those who, as being essentially of a certain type of person. They're clever, they lie, and other such things. So kind of a prototypical passage of this essentializing discourse. I wanted to see if I could sort of step back and get a richer view, to see if that might change how I interpret this particular instance. So how I'm going to sort of shift into the methods here. How does one build a model to extract this kind of library? In this case, let me start just a little bit of historical background. So this library, if there is such a thing, it would have been essentially started to take shape in the late 1800s as Japan expanded its imperial holdings. They took control of Taiwan in 1895, the Korean Peninsula in 1910, and then on to farther flung locales in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the South Seas. And here's just a representation of sort of the total colonial territory in 1942. The range here is roughly 1890s to 1940s. And my goal was really, I didn't think I can, there's a lot of dynamics at play in this period in terms of the interrelationships between Japan and its colonies. I didn't think I could capture anything close to that total, but I did want to see if I could stand further back and from the passage I just showed you. So to put this sort of concretely, imagine taking all the passages where the Chinese or other groups are singled out, converting them into kind of these word context vectors here, just like this, and aggregating all the terms that appear on either side of Chinese. I was curious to see if we'd find a subset of words disproportionately co-occurring around Chinese relative to other groups, thus potentially exposing a consistent vocabulary of racial and ethnic bias. So this was the general starting point. Now, I was aware that any kind of biased vocabulary I extracted would be specific to whatever corpus I was working on. And so my main focus was on fiction, but I didn't want to just look at fiction because it would be hard to know if the results were meaningful or specific to fiction alone. So I work with two corpora here. One is a collection of nonfiction documents, mostly journalistic pieces, taken from a corpus of about 9,000 documents between these dates, 22 million words. This is a corpus put together by linguists, which explains kind of its attempt to capture, sort of take time slices and represent them equally. And so it's from a variety of kind of general interest magazines in Japan that covers the period I'm interested in. The second corpus I use is a fiction corpus. Here's the kind of the distribution of just the total amount of texts in this corpus, and it's really sort of centered on the 20s and 30s, but extends, to the full range of this period. And it's made up of a very diverse body of fiction. So it includes kind of canonical highbrow fiction, but also genre fiction, adventure novels, detective stories, that sort of thing. So now back to the sort of the problem at hand. There was two immediate sort of things, problems that presented themselves as we developed the model, and they had to do with kind of issues of sparsity. This is not a big corpus. The first problem was really one of how to, the variation in words used to identify certain racial groups, or racial or ethnically marked groups. The different valencies of these terms are obviously critical to how we read them, but here we were really interested in their combined effect as a kind of nexus of repeated semantic association. So what we've done is I sort of using my knowledge of that period and of the words that were used to refer to both Japanese, but also these other groups, we've taken those different references and sort of aggregated them into a single term. Now, the second problem is that, I'll show you, just to give you a sense of how often these appear, this gives you the count, first the sort of the raw count, and then the percent of documents in which they appear. And as we can see from this, they show up more both by, in terms of percentage in the fiction documents, but you can also get a relative sense of which identifiers have a stronger presence. The second issue was a question of, another question of sparsity. Even in a corpus of this size, where the unified terms appear many hundreds of times, the chance of finding the same exact words around them with enough frequency to be statistically noticeable is quite low. So ironically, we needed a way to amplify the semantic signal in order to find evidence of these biased vocabularies that we were looking for. And it's at this point that we turn to word embedding models, specifically the word-to-vec implementation. For this group, I probably don't need to delve too deeply into the specifics, but for those who may not be familiar, just know that these models are quite good at capturing semantic similarity, where similarity is a function of similar context windows around two words. That means words that share similar partners in a specified context. As Firth eloquently puts it, you shall know a word by the company it keeps. It kind of captures that, that basic idea. And these models are also very good at capturing racial, gender, and other forms of inherent bias, as several major studies have shown. The words he and she, for example, will appear more semantically similar to professions typically held by men and women because at scale, corpus is likely to reflect these associations more than others. And we can see this kind of bias just based on the implementations of the word, building the word embeddings off of the two corpora that I've discussed. So this is just to give you a sense, this is the word embeddings on the nonfiction corpus and the top 5 closest terms to each of those key identifiers. Here are at least for most of them, it's a fairly expected, they show up around other terms for identifying people. With the native, however, we get a slightly different kind of vocabulary, references to a chieftain, to the word uncivilized, for example. In the fiction corpus, this actually shows up a little bit more, where the third word closest to Korean, for example, is coolie or farmer. Here, sort of, we're seeing expressed a little bit of the kinds of latent biases that are in these collections. Now, on its own, the word embedding model was quite limited in what it could tell us about patterns of racial bias. So what we decided is to kind of leverage the very rich semantic space that it creates. Specifically, we use this space to construct semantic clusters of the sort that you see here, right? So the kind of take a word and identify the closest, the most semantically similar words that are related to it. Define that as kind of a semantic cluster, and then we use these to enhance our search. So to make that more concrete, instead of searching for individual terms around Chinese, we're going to search for words that belong to the same semantic cluster and count the frequency of these clusters instead of the individual words. If lies and lying, for example, in this passage were grouped in the same cluster, we'd count them together rather than as individual words, and that would show up, sort of help amplify that signal of lying, words related to deceit or lying as being associated with Chinese. Just a technical note, we can go into this in the Q&A, but sort of building on work by Maria Antoniak and David Mimno on the instability of word embedding models, we essentially did a bootstrapped model of 20 different word embeddings, and then we built the semantic clusters out of the averages across those 20 different word embeddings. So essentially, we take like the top 5,000 words for each word, build a cluster, and then go in and identify whether those clusters show up around these racial identifiers. I'm happy to explain more of that in the Q&A. So the very last step then is to sort of, now that we have these clusters, go ahead and count them and do a very simple pairwise comparison along these lines. So, to see which clusters occur within a given racial identifier, which of them occur in significantly different proportion than another identifier, given the relative frequencies of these identifiers in the corpus. So we test for differences across these pairs here, since it's the representation of colonial others vis-a-vis representations of the colonizing Japanese that we're most interested in. And the result is a group of semantic clusters disproportionately associated with each racial identifier as compared to references to Japanese, and also vice versa. So I'll show you the results in a moment as a kind of semantic grid like this one, where the cells indicate kind of the relative strength of a particular semantic cluster. But first I want to turn to you and ask you, what would you predict will show up here? If on the left-hand side is a list of kind of these semantic clusters or a label identifying them. Now, I assume many of you are not specialists of the period, and so won't likely have a lot of good guesses, but I asked this question of specialists too, and with the same intent, which is to force us to consider our own biases before we begin the work of validation or interpretation. So pausing here is a way to remind us that our ability to interpret what is and isn't bias is always conditional on our own position, on what we've seen and heard before, on the communities of which we're a part. We may see bias where others don't, or not see it where others do. And this gets us to a second related issue, how to assess the grid's relation to some kind of ground truth. Now, in the narrow sense, this is really a question of whether we're capturing real semantic associations in the corpus, given the sort of the very roughness of the model. And then if we are, there's this bigger question of whether these associations have any relevance to the structures and conventions present in racial discourse writ large, so beyond the confines of these collections. Here I had some question marks. What would you put here, right? What categories do you think are associated with the native or with Korean? So if we look at the semantic clusters the procedure did find, we immediately face this problem of trying to align them with the biased associations we expect to be there. So you can see what this is showing. Essentially, on the left, because I can't capture the full vocabulary, I've basically created labels to identify what the vocabulary is roughly signifying. And again, so you have the clusters on the left, and then the darker the cell, the stronger the association of those words, the stronger the presence of those words are around that particular racial group. So we might, at this scale, all we can really do is generate questions. Why are capital and financial transactions associated with Chinese, for instance? Facial features and family with Westerner. The nature and landscape with the natives. Some of these make sense, for to us, and if you know this period well. But even deciding where to dive into the data requires kind of an interpretive leap, as we may be prone to see some clusters as more productive entry points based on where we expect racist vocabularies to concentrate. Right? So some of these also seem very unintuitive and strange, but potentially worth investigation. Returning to the fiction, there's a lot more categories here. One of the things that was striking to me, though, is words for buying and selling show up around Chinese, suggesting a kind of a link to what we see in the nonfiction collection in terms of money, right, or financial transaction. Facial features and family relations also show up around Westerner. And another important thing to indicate here is that even the absence of an association is actually telling us something, right? It either tells us, one, that semantic cluster does not appear around that identifier, or it appears in such a similar proportion that it's not statistically significant. So there's value even in the sort of the interpretive value, even in the absence of information. I wish I had more time to explore these grids with you, because it took us a long time to get to this point. A lot of work, but I think just digging into these cells can be equally interesting. So I'm going to sort of show you what happens now that we've got this general perspective, what happens when we go back down, and what is it that we see. So I'm going to loosen the lines of this grid a little bit and get a sense for what's driving these results. So I'm going to focus on the discourse on the native. So here are the categories, the clusters that are associated, and I'll just show you some of the words that are underneath these. You can start to imagine why some of these words might be in there. Time is an interesting one to me. Why are parts of the times of the day so associated with native? Virgin, maiden, and then the last one I've highlighted because I'm going to sort of take this one a little bit further. So words related to voice, cry, scream, sound, hear, shout, also some onomatopoetic words that are part of this cluster. So this one's particularly interesting to me because of what we see when we go back down to the passage level. That is, when we find passages where any one of these words appear in the same context window as the identifier native. I'm going to show you just a handful of those passages. There's about 80 odd such passages that fit this description. And the four I've picked here exemplify a kind of a semantic association that runs across nearly all of them. Together, the passages form an image of the native voice as an incomprehensible moaning or crying or screaming, usually one that is done collectively and by an undifferentiated mass of individuals. It's at times an ominous or fearful voice, and at other times an uncontrolled expression of joy or pleasure, or even blind allegiance to a cause. Sometimes this imagery comprises a single offhand reference, such as in this third one from a canonical novel, where the narrator protagonist is saying, "I just screamed like a savage," right? So somebody in the state of extreme frustration. But sometimes in other cases, this imagery permeates a work, as in the adventure novels by Kunieda Shiro, from which the top passage is taken. Where we have kind of this idea of all of a sudden a grotesque cry welled up from somewhere behind them being this group of white military soldiers, as poison arrows began to rain down. Other cases, we have this kind of strange phrase, gala, 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 gala. That is in the original. I haven't translated that. Burr, a voice rang out. Of course, it was the native. Now, the consistency of this image across disparate contexts suggests that the voice was crucial to the kinds of racial othering inflicted on the figure of the native during this period. This starts to, at least for me, to feel like the general perspective that Said had in mind, in that we found a vocabulary repeatedly woven into native costumes. And I think part of why the bias is so legible here has to do with the fact that it taps into a familiar structure by which humans have historically sustained racial and ethnic divisions. Those who do not speak one's own tongue or who appear to speak only in tongues are easily marked as inherently other. And it's not just the ability to speak, of course, but the quality of that speech. All the screaming and yelling remind me of what a literary critic, Sian Nye, has said, which has called the excessively lively or agitated ethnic subjects that abound in American literature. Subjects who are depicted as exaggeratedly emotional, hyper-expressive, over-scrutable, and unusually receptive to external control. We need only see this representation once to know we've seen it 1,000 times, and to see in it the familiar logic of the stereotype or of caricature. But again, easy as it is to recognize, once we've found it, we should keep in mind that we've come to this recognition by working our way up from the particular to the general and then back down again. So for me, this raises kind of two key questions, which I'll address briefly. First, what do we learn by uncovering this familiar logic in the way we have here? Is the moment of recognition different than if we'd come across any of these passages on their own? And second, what more can we do with the knowledge gained through the general perspective? I'll address the first one briefly and then spend a little bit more time with the second one as I move towards my conclusion. So as far as what we can learn by reading bias at scale, what interests me most as a literary historian is the ability to see how this bias split along different and highly specific clusters of semantic association, but also how it was differentially applied, marking certain bodies in some ways and certain bodies in others, or in some cases marking them not at all, at least not in the ways that this model is attuned to. The fact that few clusters tend to be associated with Korean, for instance, is not evidence that discrimination was absent, far from it, but only that it worked in other, perhaps more subtle ways. And indeed, we know that shifting theories of racial difference made the lines a lot less clear. All told, the general perspective we get from our semantic grid, abstract though it is, actually gives us a way to think about how vocabularies of bias adhered to different racialized subjects in varying degrees. And this in turn provides a useful background against which to interpret in particular instances where those vocabularies are activated, whether by those complicit in their perpetuation or by those trying to speak through and against them. This, I think, this is the kind of analysis that is, sort of useful in my own field. So I'm not going to go into that in too much detail here, but rather I want to sort of shift to this second question, which is, what more do we do with this knowledge? Now, in a machine learning context, the next step might be to devise ways to minimize the biased language so that it does not become embedded or reinforced in predictive systems. But for my own research purposes, it makes no sense to try to control for or eliminate the effects of racial bias. I'm not in the business of making high-stakes social predictions, but nor is there an obvious objective kind of function here, something I'm trying to predict. But I am interested in thinking about underlying processes by which the language of bias is sustained, altered, or contested in discourse and under certain historical conditions. If what we're getting from the general view are the most extreme vocabularies of bias, the most kind of stylized and outlandish costumes, to come back to Said, then I wonder if there aren't ways to work back from these vocabularies to try to unravel them, loosening their hold on these fixed racial identifiers. And so what I want to do in closing is point to one very speculative and exploratory direction that I'm pursuing in hopes that it can spark some cross-disciplinary conversations about how we respond to issues of bias in machine learning systems. Let's see. Okay. So when we think about why racial and ethnic stereotypes are so durable and successful, about why they tend to stick so well, these vocabularies of bias tend to stick, it's helpful to think about their success in the literary context as a function of characterization. That means both how characters are written into stories and how we as readers interact with them. There's a long history to these practices in fiction, and obviously it's impossible to generalize across all forms fiction has taken, but I just want to introduce two key theories that scholars have developed to explain how literary characterization has worked since the 19th century. The first one I want to introduce is this idea of the economy of character. And this has to do with an argument put forth by Deirdre Lynch, which, to really oversimplify, has two main components. First is that this preference for well-rounded characters, in the sense of having kind of richly described psychologies and inner mental lives, is actually the product of a particular historical moment in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. It marked a radical shift in the way readers were trained to value and interpret human character, which was now something to be found on the inside. The second component of our argument is that the shift was a displacement, not necessarily a kind of an elimination, a displacement of older practices of reading character from the outside, of sorting people by type according to external, superficial features. In 18th century England, it was of great utility to be able to read character in this way precisely because of increasing social complexity, in part driven by economic and imperial expansion that brought people of varying class, status, and racial backgrounds together. That's her argument. So with that in mind, I want to introduce another theory, which is kind of a corollary. This idea of the one versus the many from Alex Wallach. It's the idea that the preference for psychologically rounded characters, especially in realist narratives, created a kind of a new tension within novelistic fiction, owing to certain formal constraints. So on the one hand, giving more space to a few central characters, who you could then fill out in terms of their interiority and whatnot, meant that less attention could be given to others, leading to an unequal distribution of narrative attention. And one of the effects of having many lightly drawn characters is that their depictions slip back into caricature. Yet at the same time, the realist novel has an implicit mandate to cast its gaze over a wide, complex social universe. It aspires to give a real picture of the world, and yet to do so must fill its universes with a few richly drawn characters and many subordinate flattened ones. Now, while these theories about characterization are firmly based in histories of English fiction and the rise of the novel, they describe a set of constraints on narrative that easily extend to fiction elsewhere, but also to other media. And when these constraints are further sort of bisected by social hierarchies and divisions, which give some classes of people inordinate access to the production of narrative, the implications for representation can be devastating. Those who don't have access are systematically under-recognized, left to play the part of minor characters if they appear at all, and forced into the straitjackets of stylized costumes. And this is a problem we are all too familiar with. It's one that's entrenched across cultural industries with depressing regularity, as recent cultural analytical work has shown. Work by Eve Chrysier and Andrew Piper, and also Ted Underwood and David Baman and Sabrina Lee, which have focused on gender bias through the lens of character. I point to this work because it attests to how productive character has been as a computational way into tackling problems of equitable representation in narrative. The Bechdel test is kind of the perfect example of this. But as some of this recent work has illustrated, we can go beyond just counting characters and their connections to looking for patterns in how they are described and animated. We can look, that is, at the character text, to take Andrew Piper's word description, that surrounds certain kinds of characters to see what objects, actions, and qualities tend to be associated with them. So taking inspiration from this idea, and some of those theories of characterization I just described, I got to thinking about what happens to these vocabularies of racial bias when they get dispersed across character texts and the inequalities or asymmetries of character space. That is, what happens when the native as character slides into the native as individuated character, whether minor figure or major protagonist. Do these same vocabularies stick around? It kind of makes sense that they would, either because writers are reinforcing known stereotypes or because they feel compelled to speak through them in order to be recognized. And indeed, literary critics have explored these kinds of negotiations from countless close-up angles. But my interest here is really in the relations between the larger semantic patterns found and individual texts, so as to keep the focus on the echoes of these specific patterns. Now, right now, my very unsophisticated way of doing this, this is all very exploratory, in part because I don't have an excellent tool like BookNLP that will extract character entities from Japanese text. I would love to have that, but for now, I've basically manually identifying all characters in a subset of my corpus. I isolate each reference to a character as a kind of context window, and then I search those windows for any of the terms in the voice cluster. It's really ad hoc and unprincipled, but I simply am interested in finding texts where I can close read for evidence that these voice words had some part in characterization. I want to see how these words are deployed in modulating the threshold where flat transitions to round and caricature to character. And I do find several such texts. I don't have time to sort of go into them here, but just to give you a brief indication, in one, we have a Japanese protagonist who's exiled to a far southern island and gradually sort of transitioned into a voiceless shell of his former interiorized self as he goes native. Another text has a colonized islander in the position of a first-person narrator, and for whom words in this voice cluster become a means to differentiate other characters' relative degrees of assimilation as Japanese subjects. So this is just to say that for me, at least as a historian of this period, these initial results are promising. Now, voice, of course, is just one lexical dimension with which to kind of pry open the rules and conventions of racially biased characterization. I could draw on some of these other semantic clusters and different lines of bias that my model doesn't account for. And I think cultural analytics is just beginning to get a handle on how to model the dynamics of character at scale. But at least one takeaway for me from this exploration at the micro level is that reading for bias between the general and the particular can push our conceptual thinking on bias and interpretability in useful directions. So for me, the value comes not just from reading for bias itself, but reading for its patterns of use and then dissolution. With this in mind, I got to sort of thinking, whether it would be useful to ask what happens to vocabularies of bias as stereotypes become fuller characters. What happens as stereotypes are filled out by writers who have otherwise been flattened in the field of representation? Is there a kind of a threshold or tipping point at which these vocabularies are washed out by other, less biased lexicons? Is this point crossed in some works, some genres, or some mediums of representation sooner than others? In future work, I'm hoping to take some of these questions into other discursive domains to think more about the relative stability of biased stereotypical representations across different contexts and media. If we can come up with more robust models of these representations, might there be ways to identify where they break down, essentially? Alternatively, what if we try to model something like the inverse of stereotype, since rounded characters may in some cases be composed of just other kinds of conventions? Neutral representation may not be the dilution of bias into noise, but the substitution of other vocabularies that are only neutral to those privileged enough to see and be seen through them. Finally, and this I think is a real stretch, but I do wonder if theories of character taken from the literary field may provide a kind of a useful conceptual hinge for thinking about racial bias and predictive modeling more generally. For me, in doing this work, there was kind of a loose analogy between older practices of reading for human character via external signs and attempts to predict who a person is, on average, or how successful they'd be, what they'll buy, their chances of paying back a loan, for example. While now fancied up with sophisticated analytics and big data, this older practice still chastens, given that we live in a world where newer practices of reading character have taken root, especially since we know that these older ones are so good at maintaining oppressive and dehumanizing forms of bias. We want to know how these predictive models are thinking about us, that is, we desire interpretability because we so keenly feel the mismatch between what they see and how we see ourselves. And yet, if both practices of reading character are in some sense necessary in social life and indeed exist in this kind of constant push and pull, maybe a way to respond to bias is not just to try to eliminate it or control for it, but to think about it along this continuum between, on the one hand, these stylized costumes and something like, and I don't have the right metaphor here, but loose-fitting or ill-formed or unpredictable dress. So this is kind of where my thinking has taken me on this issue. I'd love to hear thoughts, if that inspires sort of thoughts about other directions in which to take these questions. I'd love to hear those. And let me just thank Yancheng Zhu, who was my collaborator on this project, and also Ogiso Toshinobu, who helped with acquiring the magazine Corpus. Thanks so much for listening. Yeah.
So thanks, Mike. Thanks for a great talk. For the work of Alex Wallach, right? There's a really interesting structuralist perspective he takes on character. There are some characters that you have that are sketched out in such detail that you recognize them as being human. That you could
That's right.
come in some room and have a conversation with them, and you would recognize them as being someone that's your friend or your family. But there's another class of characters that who aren't sketched out in that same level of detail, who are just essentially filling some structural role in the story. Yeah. I think the example he gives was of the group of people that Achilles kills in the Iliad, whose only purpose of existing in the Iliad was to die.
Right.
I wonder if this is something that you're seeing with this work too, that part of what you see as being interesting in terms of bias of characters is effectively that kind of structuralist dehumanization that happens.
Yeah, no, I think that's precisely what his work inspired me to sort of look for, is to see if there I think in some cases it really is just a sort of the use value of a character, is for specific ends, structural ends. But he also talks about the sort of the implications of some of these flattened descriptions for how we think about who a person is. And one of the things I didn't get to elaborate in the talk, though, is that once you have a certain number of narratives that see the world in this particular way, and if they're written by a particular group of people, anytime some other group of people shows up as a flattened character, that becomes to be sort of misrecognized as kind of reality, right? And some critics have made this argument. And so for me, what the critical point was to see if I could find these characters who, yes, they serve a structural kind of function, but the implications of them having to serve that function over and over again in narrative then produces these kinds of stereotypical representations that have real world impact in the ways that people think about who they are and who they can be. So that was my hope in sort of taking that lesson into this context and say, okay, now that we've got these biased vocabularies, let's look at some of the different types of representation that are going on, either by Japanese representing colonial others or colonized subjects who are basically writing back to empire in the Japanese language. Could I see them sort of picking up on these biased vocabularies, but then repurposing them in different ways? It's sort of a wandering answer, but yeah, I mean, I think there'd have to be more, there certainly needs to be more kind of careful distinction about what kinds of minor characters are feeding into these biased representations and which ones may just be there to serve Achilles' needs, right? It's the people who need to die, but yeah.
Maybe I missed this, but your corpus for the Japanese literature, was that in That was in English?
No, that's in Japanese. Yeah.
And then the translation was done.
So I've had to translate.
You did it.
Yes. Yeah. So what you're seeing here is, just to give you an example, like those I've translated from Japanese, but also the terms here. Yeah. So all of this, there's this layer that you're not seeing because this is not the audience, but yeah, it's Japanese language underneath all of this. Yeah.
So you initially did the search on Japanese.
Yeah. So that's
And then you
yep.
translated.
And then I have to basically translate the results so that, yeah, for English audience. Yeah.
And then the other question I had, I think it was on the last slide.
Huh?
You were looking at the discourse on the native.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't that one. Then right before that one, it was, yeah.
This one? Oh, this one?
Yeah, so I was, what I wrote down was that Makino Shinichi in 1934
Yep.
was talking about a Chinese or African savage.
Oh, right.
Struck by that,
Yeah.
but right there.
Yep.
Because yeah, I was struck.
Yeah. Yeah. I that equation there is interesting. It's not something that seems to be carried through the corpus as a whole. But yeah, I haven't sort of dug into what. Essentially, yeah, he's putting those two groups on the same kind of racial hierarchy, and what he means by Chinese savage is a little bit unclear. Like,
Right, and it
yeah,
doesn't fit in with the other findings in your corpi where they talk about the Chinese and
Yeah,
some sort of
right,
differentiated
right,
business.
yeah. So I think in that case, I mean, it is a bit of an outlier, even for me. Yeah, thanks for your questions. Yeah. Mhm.
Let's get a little more about distinctions between the two corpora, right? Whether
Yeah.
the literary one versus the non-literary one.
Yeah.
Is literary one amplifying certain biases and softening other ones? Kind of how do those pan out?
Yeah. I mean, the primary reason why I wanted to do that, because I assume that the types of language you're going to see in both of those is going to be very different, particularly in terms of how they describe others. So I expected the nonfiction corpus is going to be much more direct, that I'm going to see more really straightforward kinds of bias, versus the fiction where I expected it to be much muddier in terms of how these particular semantic clusters are relating to the identifiers. I think in terms of how to think about them, I'm particularly struck, like I tried to point out, by the points of overlap. I think that suggests that were one to go into these passages and really identify that there is something meaningful happening here, that then we'd have a way to talk about this kind of general perspective, this library of concepts that are being drawn upon and are so sort of pervasive that writers in a journalistic medium versus fiction are in sort of unconsciously drawing on them. But then there's also kind of the interesting differences that come out. In particular, one of the ones that's sort of interesting to me, and which I don't have a good explanation for, is the personal pronouns category. Why is it that these mostly references to I, we, or things like that? Why do they tend to show up more around these racial identifiers as compared with Japanese? That actually sort of goes against what I would expect. That doesn't sort of come back to the question of how it relates to nonfiction. But I do think that with each of these, and I didn't really stress this enough, is that each of these cells, we shouldn't sort of take for granted as identifying an actual, a true bias until you've gone down and sort of validated at the passage level. It's really kind of a map through which to explore and see if what's happening at the passage level really sort of backs up what we see at this stage. Yeah, but it's a great question. I'd like to, if I had more space and time in the chapter from which this comes, like, I think there's a wealth of directions in which one could go to explore those differences. And for me, it's really more just to sort of establish a contrast and say that what we're going to see based on each corpus is going to be very different. And the overlap and the non-overlap may be interesting points to dive into the results. Yeah. There's a question back. Tom? Oh, no? Okay. Another question?
Expansion on that question. So it was about the personal pronouns and why they appeared there, why they were stronger in the Korean section than in the others. It goes along with your reading of kind of absence as a marker of dehumanization when you get to the native example.
Yep.
But I wonder just about other categories of bias that are not just racialized terms, but the co-occurrence of personal pronouns tells us that a certain kind of personhood is established there. I don't know what to make of school and education on the Korean side.
Right.
But yeah, just what are the other categories that you find pertinent that go beyond specific tags, I guess, that indicate bias? And also, I guess, in terms of character distribution, is there a certain level at which just in the pure numerics of the character, if we have, 45 appearances of a Korean character, does that tell us also something about the focus of a given text?
Yeah. So in this cases where I'm just looking at sort of references to Korean or Chinese and not the character, I think there's less of a chance that kind of the narrative content is going to, bias the results. But I do think, it's really those concepts that are somehow kind of confounding and unexplainable, where it raised the question for me, like, okay, it's not a kind of bias we recognize as such, but were you to go down and analyze those passages, would it somehow confirm some artifact of bias that is really not explicit at all? I think that's a really sort of interesting direction to go with these. Just to give you, I think to put these in a different perspective, one thing I didn't have time to show you, but which is pretty useful as a contrast, we can do that comparison that I showed you between Japanese and racial identifiers. We can go the other direction. So these are the semantic clusters that show up more around Japanese versus each of the sort of racial identifiers. And what struck me is that speech, words related to speech and cognition, so thought, thinking, I'm saying, they show up much more around Japanese, the words for Japanese, than they do around words for native, which in some ways kind of fits in with what we see when we look at the other direction, is that they're literally having their voices and thoughts taken away from them. But I think you also can see in some of these terms that these are, modernity and tradition, or political ideology, sciences, spirituality, and ethics. These are the things that are talked about when we assume, an audience of other Japanese, right? So I think, playing the results I showed you with this is also potentially very useful. Yeah.
Somewhat along the same lines, the semantic grids are really helpful for me, and I like the example of how you kind of dug in, did kind of a close read of screen, the voice and the native. My last 6 years were at a public health research facility, so we use disability weights. So I was kind of doing a comparison. Like, I was curious if I see those categories, and I'm curious if there's any sort of weight that's associated with categories or words. Because I can certainly think in my mind, there's some very, inflammatory words. Versus there's some words that you know, people kind of miss.
Right.
There's certainly, you can weight
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
The research has been done.
No, I haven't. I'm not applying any sort of weighting. And the only sort of measure for that is just sort of the frequency of occurrence. But I'm not really applying weighting based on, you know, connotation or anything. For that, I essentially, you know, with this approach, you really have to go back down and sort of identify what's happening at the passage level to just to confirm how these words are being used.
Incredibly subjective as well.
Yes. Yep.
And just final question, I'm just really interested in terms of the methods. Have you published the models? Do you have an open repository?
For this, I will once it's all completed. It's part of a book project that I'm wrapping up. But yeah, the idea is to we'll make all of the code and stuff available. I'm happy to talk offline if you want to have it. You know, contact me. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I'm also kind of interested in the category of voice. So I wonder if you also included, you know, like silence, as well as those kind of the kind of noise-like utterances. So and also it's not just about how their voice is mentioned. It's also about how their voice is represented, right? So because there are certain cases like when natives, their voices are represented, they are also kind of transcribed in a certain form, such as katakana, so to indicate the difference. So I wonder how this kind of formal distinction can be also taken into account in your method.
It doesn't really take into account, well, the question about silence is interesting because you know, how do we expect that to show up kind of lexically? Like what words would be used? It hasn't shown up in that kind of direct way, but I think it's something I talk about when I go and look at some of these works that show this close relationship between voice and kind of native characters. I talk about sort of the silence that's written into them through the process of characterization. I don't think this model would be sensitive enough to sort of pick up on that. It really is dependent in some ways on the semantic clusters that are built from the word embedding model. So you know, if a particular, you know, a collection of terms related to sort of how the voice is represented, if that doesn't kind of enter into these clusters, then it would be hard to identify it at that scale. And I think that's really just a sort of a question of how imprecise this model can be for some kinds of questions, but you know, extracting these larger structures, these larger patterns is really kind of a key first step. And it's through that lens, which I can go down and sort of see actually, okay, what's happening on the page and how does seeing it through this lens of this larger structure sort of change how we read those moments. Thanks for your question.
Much for sharing these findings. I had a further comment perhaps on I think it was on maybe the previous slide, the one with Korean and then the education and school.
Yeah.
There we go, thanks. So initially when I saw that, I thought of colonization right away because of the length of time and the fact that people were forced to change their names to Japanese and also speak Japanese and not speak Korean.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, it didn't have a positive.
No, it doesn't. No. Yeah.
My family's very, you know, go to Oxford, all that kind of stuff. It doesn't always have that that connotation.
No, you're right to point that out, and we can see that because you have that contextual information. But indeed, most of these texts are probably narratives about Korean subjects who are attending Japanese schools because they're forced to do so. Yeah. Right? Okay.
Well, thanks for this awesome talk. I wanted to talk about, I guess, the word bias, which is such a tricky word when you're doing digital work, because it has this double meaning of both a kind of statistical tendency, but also an ethical implication. So, and then I'm going to try to move to your last question, which I think is really important, about how literary character can maybe help us think about the difference between statistics and sort of unethical. Because from what I understand, I'm not an expert on the machine learning side, but like what the typical example is that the word programmer in a vector space is closer to man than it is to woman. So it's picking up this association that is a part of our patriarchal world that shouldn't be there. Nevertheless, like programmer is probably closer to computer than it is to blackboard or something. It's a bias in a statistical sense, but it's not necessarily a bias.
Ethical, right? Doesn't raise ethical issues.
Question for all of us is, how do you tell the difference between how does one identify these moments of sort of inappropriate association? And so that's why, coming to this grid, it's interesting, like, it's very effective, your reading of voice, because it shows us, okay, the reason that this word is associated with this group has to do with associations about their nature of their otherness and the othering work that a kind of undifferentiated voice does to them. But would you say that all of, like, is distinctiveness itself along these groups already an appropriate generalization, or are we looking for something else? No,
that's a great question. It was, I didn't want to be in the sort of the position of parsing those distinctions, so that's why I've sort of just shown everything that came out of the model. And I do think that's a great sort of analogy to think about sort of what things might show up around a particular group, sort of a centralized group of people, via a bias that is not necessarily sort of driven through racial hierarchy or whatnot, but as a product of certain kinds of context, right? Like the word for light and shine, for example. I imagine this is referencing, kind of novels that are set in sort of South Seas islands and reflect scenes of describing the ocean and this bright sunlight of those places. Is that, I guess it's a biased vocabulary in the kind of the flat sense that you're suggesting, right? In a statistical sense, whether we read that as somehow kind of ethically questionable, that there, I think, is that's where it falls back to interpretation, to argue for or against. Does that, I don't know, that it's unsatisfying, but
the only thing I'd tack on is I feel like another to try to get, also I want to talk a little bit about interpretability. Because in not to get too insider baseball, but sometimes in text mining, we don't care about the features that are used to try to distinguish two genres or et cetera. You've done all this very careful work showing us the kinds of semantic clusters that do this distinctive work. So would you tell people doing text mining or this type of work that kind of analysis of the distinguishing features is necessary in order to sort of responsibly extract meaning from the model? Or?
Yeah, I would say that in this context, when you're dealing with this type of subject, this topic matter, I think absolutely. And obviously that doesn't, past a certain scale, that doesn't work, right? Because we can't extract it in the way I've done here. So, I mean, I guess one of the virtues of working in the Japanese language context is that I have so much less to work with than those who do text mining in the English language context. But by virtue of that, I'm able to still sort of stay tethered somewhat to the text itself and these kinds of, like, the quality and the composition of the feature sets. So yeah, I think it's a question that has to do with, as it scales up, like, how can you find ways to get back? And there, I just think we have to be more creative in how we do that and open up the possibility to really understand what it is, is driving the kinds of biases we see. Yeah.
Just related to that question, a lot of the conversation around interpretability, inputs, outputs, the model. Here, right, interpretation comes from expanding the lens a little bit, right? Like you're going from a particular to actually looking at the text surrounding it and then going in and reading the text. And so it's very different, yeah. It's a different way of thinking about how you plumb the model. And I'm just, I'm wondering about like how that might be helpful in thinking about, we talked about legibility, et cetera. So if you could, I don't know.
Yeah, it's something that I guess sort of comes more naturally as somebody trained in literary criticism. That it's always a matter of kind of not letting your position become fixed in any one spot, but sort of traversing, going back and forth. In a sense, I guess, of just inherent kind of skepticism about whether, once you've obtained kind of a larger or a scaled up abstracted view, like how well is that a generalization of what's happening kind of underneath? And so I think that tension is really important for this work, but other types of work in this domain, in this space of cultural analytics. Yeah, I would love to see if that transferred over to kind of the engineering space or machine learning. How it is that we sort of think about interpretability. I don't think I'm qualified to sort of say how that would, but I to the extent that this sort of the processes that and the interpretive processes that I've put forth here, I would love to sort of think more about how those might be built into the kind of systems that are being created around machine learning. Yeah. But that's a big question.
Thanks for the great talk. Going back to kind of the questions about scaling up and trying to understand what the different drivers were, I was wondering if you had speculated, or if you would speculate, about what a semantic grid might look like in a different context. So for example, a different period in Japanese literature, or as you were speaking, some of the examples made me think about, Victorian literature and kind of othering and exoticism there. And so I just didn't know if you had any thoughts about, what those would look like and what it would mean to try and look across them.
No, I mean, I think I certainly couldn't do that work on my own, but the potential for doing this kind of comparative studies of racism is huge. Mark Algiua and Hannah Walzer and J.D. Porter, at Stanford have done some of this work on 19th century and 20th century fiction, and the kinds of things. So they haven't sort of, their process is a little bit different, but they do use word embeddings and similar types of underlying methods to get at this discourse in that context. And I think I've talked with them about some of this work, and in the future it would be really interesting to see how these work. And I've always sort of wondered, to what extent are sort of the 19th century kind of racial discourse, a lot of that is brought into Japan and adopted as Japanese try to position themselves both as wanting to be closer to the West and to whiteness, and then differentiate themselves from those who they see, who they've colonized. And so in that kind of middle position, you know, what are they doing with the discourses of racial hierarchy and discrimination that they are importing through Western texts? There's a lot of, I think, interesting questions that could be asked, you know, once we sort of have this kind of comparative dimension, but also thinking about it at this large scale. Yeah, thanks.
Question, or we could start. All right, I think you.
Thanks for listening. Yeah, okay.
Once again to our speaker today, and I don't know if you'll stick around for a few minutes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah.
Ask a quick question.
Yeah. Thanks so much.